Well, thanks, Patricia, and thanks to the Overseas Press Club, and also to my old friend David Andelman and Pamela Title for endowing this prize, which is an interesting one. As you say, it puts a spotlight on pieces that illuminate the human condition. Let me tell you briefly what the judges said about the winning entry, and then we will get very quickly to the main event, which is to talk to the people who created it. DIY Mosul, obviously meaning do-it-yourself Mosul, by NPR's extraordinary podcast, Rough Translation, tells us a series of unexpectedly engaging stories from Iraq's second largest city, which of course was the crucible in Iraq of the war against ISIS. Jane Arraf and her team found several independent civic groups who were doing work that the local government wasn't performing. They were clearing streets of corpses, rescuing books from a destroyed library, even repairing the city water system. And these stories of grassroots civic action were told with uncommon sensitivity and insight into Iraqi culture. And the reason the judges loved it was this. Not only was it beautifully reported and elegantly executed, but it told us things about Iraq that even after decades of reading and listening and watching about Iraq, I think most Americans didn't know. We are all used to seeing Iraq in a framework of war, of conflict, chaos, sectarian strife. These were stories about ordinary Iraqis, or I should say extraordinary Iraqis perhaps, because they were people who decided to pitch in and rebuild their city as volunteers. Let me also say a word, if I may, about Jane, whom I have known for several years. I was long ago a Middle East correspondent based in Beirut, but my tenure there doesn't hold a candle to Jane's. She has produced one of the most distinguished and durable bodies of work in that difficult part of the world. If I'm not mistaken, Jane, you arrived in the Middle East in 1991 when you worked for Reuters. I am not going to do the calculation on how many years ago that was.
A lot of years.
Many years, many actually, as Arabs sometimes count. There is 1, 2, 10, and many. But she has worked for CNN. She was expelled once by the Saddam Hussein government. She covered the American invasion in 2003, covered the battles in Fallujah, Najaf, Samarra, and Tel Afar, covered Iraq for NBC News, PBS, the Christian Science Monitor, now NPR, but very, very soon is moving back to Baghdad as the New York Times bureau chief there. So congratulations are in order to Jane for that news. As well as this prize. The New York Times, in its announcement of her appointment, said something you never hear the New York Times say. They said, "We got luckier than we ever imagined." So that's another tribute to Jane. We've also got with us here Gregory Warner, who is the creator and host of Rough Translation, Sana Krasikov, the co-creator of Rough Translation, who was one of the editors on this piece, Michael May, the head of NPR's Story Lab, and a field producer. So I hope everyone watching this podcast has given themselves the pleasure of listening to the piece. But just in case there are a few who haven't, Jane, tell us about the story. Tell us how you came across it, and give us along the way a bit of a summary of what's in it.
Thanks so much, Doyle. And first, I just want to say briefly how thrilled we were to be given this award and the idea behind this particular award, which is the human condition, because while it's deeply important to bear witness to conflict and war, it's what happens after, really, that I think tells us about a society and about people. So after the battle for ISIS, And that battle took a long, long time. The battle for Mosul, sorry, where US-backed Iraqi forces drove ISIS out of Mosul, took 9 months. And it was the fiercest fighting in decades in an urban setting. All sorts of civilians died, thousands of them, many of them in airstrikes that were targeting ISIS fighters. So when ISIS had been cleared out of Mosul, we were finally able to go in and walk around, and there was almost nobody there. And not only was there nobody there, it was almost completely silent because either everyone was dead or they had fled. The trees were gone, the birds were gone, entire city blocks were destroyed. It was the most incredible destruction I had ever seen. And I've covered a lot of war, but this was just beyond belief. And we walked around, myself and our amazing local producer, Sangar Khalil, and thought, how does anyone ever come back from this? How does a city come back from this? And we kept going back week after week, and people would trickle in. They would get permission from the military. They would go with civil defense forces, and they would be looking for the bodies of their loved ones that they had had to bury in a garden, or that they knew had been crushed in debris when buildings fell. And it just seemed almost impossible that this city could recover. But as we kept going back, we kept meeting people who were out there doing things. And they were not government officials, they weren't UN people, they weren't aid organizations, they were people from Mosul. And they were mostly young people. And they were doing things like giving money to people who were trapped so they could buy food, restoring electricity to houses that had where people were living in without power or water. There was this extraordinary young woman who was collecting dead bodies because no one else was doing it, and she was diffusing suicide belts. They were out there and they were doing things. So we followed two of them in particular, Safwan al-Madani, who created this wonderful organization, which translates basically as make it better or make it more beautiful. And a nurse named Sarur, who insisted that she was going to be the one to go and pick up bodies and dispose of them and diffuse suicide belts. And it was against the backdrop of this city that for years had been held captive, not just by ISIS, but before ISIS by Al-Qaeda. And then before that, it was never really stable, but it was this extraordinary city full of culture, but one you couldn't really get at. So when we went back, we basically were asking the question, and I had kind of a vague idea, and Greg took this idea and gave it shape and form. And really the thought behind it was, how do you come back from such immense tragedy? And what is it that makes a city survive? And what is it in people that allows them to go on? And what indeed makes things better?
Jane, thanks. Mosul is thought of in Iraq as an extraordinary city for a number of reasons, but were these people ordinary Iraqis, extraordinary Iraqis? Were these the great exceptions to the rule?
You know what it was? I think part of it is this is a new generation. This is not the generation that lived under Saddam, that holds that terror, the people that you would have met, that we've all met in the Middle East under dictatorships. They were Iraqis who grew up with internet until it was taken away from them by ISIS. They had opinions, they had thoughts, and they didn't have, despite everything, they didn't really have that fear. The other part of that was they had also grown up having the government do essentially nothing for them. They weren't expecting the government to come to the rescue. They knew they had to do things themselves. I think it's an example of ordinary people who, when tested, turn out to be extraordinary. But as one of the characters in there says, Safwan, who created this whole organization of volunteers, he said his goal is to make it normal for people to volunteer, to care about their neighbors, to do things. And that's really behind it too. They want to create a new society.